Golden Dayin, hi, and welcome back to Icelandic for Foreigners. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the difference between Hugsa, Halda, and Finnast. Now, the reason that we need to look at the difference between all these verbs is because all of them can be translated as think in English, and this can sometimes be very confusing for people learning Icelandic. Most of the time, these three words are not used interchangeably. They all mean something very specific, and so it's important to know what the difference is between them. Let's start with að hugsa. So here's when you use it. You use að hugsa to describe the actual act of thinking. And I like to think of this picture of the statue because hugsa, it doesn't have to do with actually having formed an opinion. It's just actually your brain is thinking about the thing. So it's most often used with the prepositions and til, which we'll see some examples of in the next slide. It's rarely used with dependent clauses, meaning we rarely use it to say, I think that. It's usually just, I think about. So let's look at some examples. Hún hugsar oft málið means she thinks often about the issue. She doesn't have any specific opinion about the issue. She's just engaging in the process of thinking. Here's another example. Ég hugsa til hennar þegar ég heyri lagið means I think about her when I hear the song. Often when we talk about thinking about a person, we use the preposition til. And here's another example. Láttu mig hugsa just means let me think. Now, I mentioned before that hugsa is rarely used with dependent clauses, but it can be. So here's an example of one. Ég hugsa að séra Haukur myndi samþykkja það. This is a sample sentence I found on the Icelandic corpus. And it means, I think Reverend Haukur would agree with that. I'm going to hold off on talking about this one for just a minute till we get through learning about að halda, so I can talk about the difference between this sentence and one where we use the verb að halda. So let's move on to að halda. When to use it? We use this verb to mean think when we're talking about a belief about something that is either true or not. It's not merely expressing an opinion. And unlike að hugsa, halda is often used with dependent clauses, meaning we use it to say, I think that. And the third thing to know about að halda is it has a very similar meaning to trúa, which means to believe. So let's look at some examples. Hann heldur að fundurinn byrji klukkan 9. This means he thinks the meeting will begin at 9 o'clock. Now, the time that a meeting begins is either true or not true. It's either yes or no. So we use halda when we're talking about facts, things that either are or aren't. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't disagree about the fact, but when we use að halda, we're talking about the subject's belief that something is true. So here's another example. Hún hélt að hann ætlaði að mæta means she thought he was going to come. Now, him coming, that's either yes or no, so she believes that the answer is yes, he will come. Now, again, this doesn't mean that she's correct or that she's right. It's possible that he won't come, but she believes that yes, he will come. And here's one more example. Já, ég held það, which just means yes, I think so. This is when we're talking about something that either is or isn't true. Now, compare these two sentences. We looked at this one earlier. Ég hugsa að séra Haukur myndi samþykkja það, which means I think Reverend Haukur would agree with that. And ég held að séra Haukur myndi samþykkja það. So here we're using halda instead. And it probably translates to the same thing in English. The difference between these is subtle. First of all, the second sentence is probably more common that you would hear that. But you can also use hugsa. The difference is in the bottom one, we're saying I have a belief that he would agree with that. Whereas the top one is just saying I'm thinking that he will, that I am considering the idea that he would agree with that. So it's not a big difference, but the bottom sentence here is probably more common. Let's talk about að finnast. So when do you use it? You use it for an opinion about something that is not black and white. It's not yes or no. And we'll look at some examples of that on the next slide. The other thing to know is that it has a very unique construction. It's an impersonal verb. I'm not going to go deep into that in this video. I'm going to make a different video about impersonal verbs. But basically what that means is that our subject or at least the semantic subject, is not in nominative, it's in dative. All right, let's look at some examples. Mér finnst íslenskan erfið. This means I think Icelandic is hard. Now, the reason we use finnast here instead of Halda is because whether or not Icelandic is hard depends on who's saying it. It's all about the personal opinion of the person who's saying it. So it's not a yes or no, either Icelandic is or isn't hard. Rather, I may think it's hard, but someone else might think it's easy, or someone else might think that it's very hard. So in this case, it's not yes or no, black or white. It's just the personal opinion of the subject. So here's another example. Okkur finnst það ekki gaman. That means we don't think it's fun. Or the sentence finnst þér það, which just means do you think so? And that specifically means do you have this particular opinion about it, not do you think that it's true. So let's look at these two examples. We're going to compare a use of að halda and finnast. So here's the first example. Ég held að húsið sé 2 ára gamalt, which means I think the house is 2 years old. So compare that with Mér finnst húsið fallegt, which means I think the house is beautiful. Now, in the top sentence, I'm talking about the house's age, a belief that I have about the house's age. Now, I'm either correct or incorrect. It either is 2 years old or it isn't, which means we need to use að halda. But in the bottom sentence, we're talking about the house being beautiful. I may think it's beautiful, but someone else might not. So we're talking about an opinion. It's not something that is true or not true. It's just the opinion of the speaker or of the subject. Let's compare some other examples. So here I have a sort of question-answer dialogue. So if we have the question, hún hávaxnari en þú, which means, is she taller than you? We could have a response, ég held það, which means, I think so. So compare that with, if you were asked, hann pirrandi, which means, is he annoying? And your answer might be, mér finnst það, which means, I think so. Now, in the top sentence, we're talking about how tall somebody is compared to somebody else, which means this is dealing with something that either is or isn't true, and that's why we use að halda. But in the bottom one, we're talking about somebody being annoying, which I might think that somebody is annoying, but somebody else might not think so. So that's why we're using að finnast. Now, there are scenarios where you might use finnast when you're talking about how tall somebody is. For example, you might want to say, I think he is too tall, in which case you might use finnast, mér finnst hann of hávaxinn. So I know it's kind of tricky, but just remember that we use halda when we're talking about something that either is correct or isn't correct. And we use finnast when there's a little bit more room for personal opinion. Thank you very much for watching. Please feel free to leave comments or questions below. Bless, bless.